we're looking forward to your talk. Presenter view? What's that in Spanish? Sorry, I thought I could. That's okay. This when you see your slide. Okay, check, check. All right. So I'm going to talk about the historical ecology of cultural landscapes. And I'm going to do this from an archaeological perspective. So between Peter and I, you'll have a nice dose of social sciences tonight. Although I don't think we always identify as just that. And unfortunately, fortunately, we're going to hang out in the temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest for most of the talk, but I think there's going to be a lot of kind of broad applications that can be made to other regions as well. For decades now, researchers have studied and abstracted and tinkered with this idea of the cultural landscape. These are spatial units that encompass the broadest range of a society's land use behaviors, as well as the history of people interacting with the natural world. In settler nations like Canada, America, Australia, cultural landscapes include very vast and interconnected networks of indigenous peoples' homelands, trails and roads, tended and managed forests, cultivated shores, cultivated intertidal shorelines, as well as the more than material infrastructures that constitute placemaking. So this includes things like governance structures, ownership, land-based laws, and genealogies. These are all part of a cultural landscape. As practitioners of historical ecology, I like that Peter talked about the kind of the two tastes of historical ecology. Of course, I'm going to be talking from the kind of Bill Belay, Carol Crumley school, which stems from archaeology and anthropology. And in that context, historical ecologists have really come to appreciate that, or have even internalized the idea that ancient and ongoing indigenous land use and management has transformed all ecosystems on Earth. And this is one of Bill Belay's four core postulates of historical ecology, right? There's not an ecosystem left on Earth that's been untouched in some form by humans. But not only that, in very recent years, researchers have come to recognize what indigenous peoples have always known, that many of those same land use and management practices have a disproportionately greater role in maintaining and stewarding some of the most biologically and functionally diverse ecosystems on Earth. So the IPCC now recognizes a large and growing body of scientific literature, in fact, probably just within the last 5 years or so, which demonstrates the critical role of many indigenous communities as guardians of the world's lands and forests. And there's a counterpoint to this too that I'll talk about, but basically what we're seeing in a lot of this literature is lower rates of deforestation, lower carbon emissions, higher carbon storage, more equitable and sustainable forest restoration efforts, and basically just more benefits for more people. Generally, we see better environmental, economic, and social outcomes on Indigenous-owned lands versus public or private entities, including protected areas. This growing realization is in step with what we call the decolonial turn, or decolonial thinking, which has certainly existed since the very inception of modern forms of colonialism, right, starting in the 1500s and 1600s, but there has been a very profound shift in the 60s and 70s, right? There's almost a growing disillusion with modernization and technocracy, which is still unfolding now. So it's an unfinished project, this decolonial turn. And we can think of it as a bit of a counterpoint to the accelerated rhythm of capitalist exploitation of labor and land, of colonial exploitation of labor and land. And again, it's clear that this project will remain unfinished for some time, because despite the growing awareness among researchers, even in popular science, increasingly about Indigenous peoples' homelands, these are still virulently contested spaces, and we still have a lot of work that needs to be done. Colonization and coloniality still persist in all facets of archaeology, historical ecology, and just academia in general. In the Pacific Northwest of North America, despite decades and decades of research on the topic, the notion of Indigenous peoples' homelands as culturally mediated and managed spaces is still challenged. It's challenged in Canadian courts, it's challenged in public policy, in environmental regulations. I don't know if there's any anthropologists in the room, but if you don't have experience with this, that's okay. All I'll say is that in the early 1900s, the Pacific Northwest was kind of like the rock star hangout for anthropologists. People from all over the world came to study societies in the Pacific Northwest because they were so perplexed by the fact that there were complex, stratified societies with monumental architecture and public works, but all without agriculture and all without extensive land use. So this perplexed anthropologists, right? Because it kind of confounds the typical pathway of cultural evolution. Now, early settlers, we see in historical texts often using these ideas or writing these ideas down, like there was no agriculture, and like look at these large longhouses, and there was slave systems and hierarchy, but no agriculture, no agriculture. And certainly some historians have pointed to the fact that early settlers had very good reason to ignore people's land use history, right? That was part of settlement narratives. But what we see is that successive generations of researchers, knowingly or not, further contributed to that erasure of the cultural landscape, either by downplaying or ignoring people's land use and management practices. But we know now from mostly piecemeal ethnographies, right, the written record in places like Canada and the US is very short, and so ethnographies are one of the main texts that we use to source historical data, and going back even further, depending on the type of research that was done. But we know from these ethnographies, and more importantly from a lot of Indigenous scholars and Indigenous communities who have been saying for a long time, you know, people have been actively constructing, managing, and engineering local environments. Despite there being no agriculture, right, people were burning, people were tilling, people were pruning, coppicing, seed broadcasting, transplanting, mulching, fertilizing, weeding, and even irrigating. And this resulted in supposedly wild ecosystems, still termed wild ecosystems today. Places like managed berry groves, Gary oak ecosystems, camas prairies, and more recently forest gardens, which I'll talk about. As a result of some of these themes, you know, archaeologists and anthropologists working in settler nations are deeply implicated in the discourses of land use and colonialism. So this is a huge, huge topic in historical ecology in places like Canada. And people are implicated in this discourse whether they want to be or not. And as a research program, we face a few challenges then. And so one of the most obvious challenge, like Peter talked about a bit, Most obviously, we draw on very powerful explanatory data sets, but these are materialist viewpoints, right? Not to be confused with cultural materialism for any anthropologists in the crowd, but it's a trace-centric science. We're piecing together very disparate, very incomplete, and even ephemeral narratives, right? The ethnographies and the historical texts are great, but how do we investigate and document the material signatures of and legacies on the land, especially if those practices, like we see in the Pacific Northwest, were meant to just enhance or mimic natural processes. And Kawika Winter, an ecologist from Hawaii, calls this eco-mimicry on the island, right? It's not this net turnover in species that you can easily identify. And again, as we go further and further back through time, those traces get scanter and scanter. Another challenge is that as historical ecologists, again, coming from the Bill Belay, Carol Crumley school of thought, is that we focus on the interpretation of culture and environment, not on human adaptation to environment. And there's a real succinct difference here, because focusing on something like culture and not merely adaptation to environment, this is very regionally specific. This is obviously very culturally specific. And so these are data that are drawn from areas that can't be, scaled up or modeled very easily. And as we become more in step with the decolonial turn, these are fundamentally anti-colonial positionalities, which can become politicized and certainly framed in identity politics, which tends to question scientific rigor. So considering all this, with the rest of the time we have, I'm going to highlight just some of the ways in which my colleagues and I have worked to first develop some of those succinct methodologies and practices that combine archaeological, ecological, linguistic, adauch, and other empirical data, and which ultimately, not on purpose, but as a result, tend to counter, challenge colonial narratives and perspectives about people and land. Okay. Like I mentioned, land use legacies can be challenging to document, right? Again, if those practices aren't resulting in large-scale shifts in, the domestication of a plant species, or if you're not getting a huge kind of imprint on the landscape. So it can be hard to spot. And one of the approaches used, of course, is to start by looking at a contemporary landscape and asking, how did it get this way? And Peter, I don't know if you remember this, but a few years ago, we were emailing about a paper, and we were talking about these two things. And one of my favorite things that you say, and I still use to this day, is that we look at cultural patterns and biophysical processes where neither is the protagonist. And I think this is really important, because in context, Canadian context, American context, I tend to see, folks in anthropology and archaeology really overemphasizing human impacts and human roles in ecosystem change. And then the reverse, of course, where ecologists tend to ignore or downplay people. And so really it's scrutinizing these two things on a kind of equal playing field that becomes really important. So to document historical and ancient management in the Pacific Northwest, some of the things that we've started to look for are some of these patterns. Plants associated with archaeological sites. Good start. Lots of folks do that. Plants growing outside their natural range or natural habitat. Plant assemblies that are more rich or more diverse, and plant assemblies that are ethnobotanically significant. Focusing on plants outside their natural range or natural habitat, we can start to key in on practices like transplanting and translocations. While some plant ranges in the Americas appear to be wild, loaded term, they are in fact the result of ancient plant movements, of people moving favorable species throughout their homelands throughout time. Again, not resulting in those large-scale genetic shifts like you would see in the isolation and domestication of cultivars. So we outline this kind of multi-method approach that uses ethnographic, ecological, and archaeological data, and we've been able to show how to at least start thinking about documenting ancient plant movements. Again, in the Pacific Northwest, but this sort of thing could really lend itself to other regions as well, especially temperate regions. So we compiled these lines of evidence, kind of spanning these different spatial and temporal ranges, looking at things like linguistic evidence, looking at oral histories, phytogeographic indices, and we concluded that where a species was referenced in 3 or more of these categories or lines of evidence, it was probably a good candidate to start looking at human-assisted movement. So some of the species included Almelancur alnifolia, Comicia kamash, nicotiana, and I'll give you an example specifically with hazelnut. So this is the contemporary distribution of hazelnut in British Columbia on the northwest coast. And what we have is a California variety. These used to be 2 different species. They're now different varieties. And so this California variety in the south there, that obviously goes all the way down to California. And then on the western slope of the Rockies is this interior hazelnut. And then in the north, there's what ecologists have called a disjunct or isolated population. And the narrative is that, it was probably part of a previously larger distribution from the population in the north, and that it was cut off by a geological event like a glacier. Morphologically, however, it doesn't seem to really add up. The involucre on the hazelnut is much more similar to what we see in the south, and the nut itself typically grows in 4 to 5 nuts per cluster rather than the 1 to 2. And so this became kind of an interesting thing for us to explore. Looking at the paleobiolinguistics becomes really interesting too. So this northern region is known as Giksan and Tsimshian territory, and their word for hazelnut is skan t'ech. Skan referring to any woody shrub, and t'ech referring specifically to the nut. Very, very similar to the Proto-Salish and Squamish word for hazelnut, t'ech. Now, there are 11 indigenous language families in Canada. 9 of them are in BC. This is a very, very linguistically diverse region. And these are entirely different language families. So it's impossible that these are cognates. And it's very likely that it was a loan word, and we think a lone nut. This compelled us to further investigate the distribution. So we collected leaf tissues from throughout the province, over 300 samples, and we examined the genetic structure of populations using GBS, or genotype by sequencing. And what we're looking at is probably a fairly normalized haplotype distribution in the south and into the slope of the Rockies. But in the north, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. Not only are all haplogroups in the province represented here, there are 2 additional and unique populations that grow exclusively at archaeological village sites, including that population in green, which is Tamlahamid. This is the origin, city, and place of all Tsimshian, Nishka, and Giksan people. And it's important to note the hazelnut up here, it's not like it's a few, scattered populations. It is, in some cases, the dominant understory of the forest. And so this is, for us, unequivocal evidence that hazelnut was managed to some extent by people, naturalizing over time, calling into question what is wild, understanding how we can study diversity, certainly at this scale, and to what extent people are acknowledged in this process. Hazelnut is a wild species, and in British Columbia, there's no idea of it being managed. There's a very small pocket of us that are just toying with this idea. Now, the connection of hazelnut to large archaeological village complexes is also worth noting. The connection between plant assemblies and where people live for a very long time is another compelling tool for historical ecologists. Again, this isn't new. There's been a lot of work on this in Central America, South America, and here in Europe. But following the hazelnut trail, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that this was part of a larger modified landscape. And this led to the reemergence of Spachgangan, which is a Giksan word meaning a place where you garden in the forest. We now call these forest gardens. Loosely defined as semi-open, broadleaf forests, lots of small fruit and nut trees, fruit shrubs, edible herbaceous root foods, so things like Malus fusca, Shepherdia canadensis, tons of vaccinium, prunus, rubus, viburnums, Fritillaria campchensis, many, many more. And the assembly of species, of course, varies site to site between the north and the south, and the composition of species closer to the coast versus those further inland. But we know they grow exclusively at old home sites. We've now identified 14 forest gardens throughout the Lachgyop in Tsleil-Waututh, Chehalis, Nuchatlit, Gitgata, Gitniau, Kitsalis, Kitsimkalem. I have to say all the names, it's respect. The majority of these sites, though, have not been inhabited, or people haven't been there for at least 150 to 200 years, largely because of colonial displacement policies. And so these places have not been managed or maintained in a really long time. Despite this, and despite the fact that the species growing in the forest gardens are wild and plentiful throughout British Columbia, as environmental scientists and bureaucrats always want to tell me, but it's the specific assembly of all these species, all these ethnobotanically important species in one spot. That's what we're flagging here. And so with all the sites, one of the things we did is every forest garden kind of has this looming large conifer forest that's moving in on it. This is kind of your typical temperate rainforest, what you think of when you think of the Pacific Northwest, right? Lots of cedar, lots of spruce, pine, and the conifer forest is kind of coming in on the forest garden. And so we looked at comparing these two types of forests, again with those paired 14 sites. And so we did some soil analyses and botanical inventories between the forest gardens and periphery sites, and indicator species analysis showed, what are the indicator species for forest gardens? All delicious foods. What are the forest garden or periphery forests indicator species? Again, these typical kind of conifer trees, conifer dominant trees in the Pacific Northwest, but it's important to note that the conifer forests aren't, acultural or ahuman. These are incredibly well-spaced trees. There's not a lot of big stumps like you would see in a cut block or something. So people were probably intermittently managing the periphery forest as well, probably through fire. In all my shovel tests, there's always, charcoal lenses and micro charcoal everywhere. But if you look at the ethnobotanical significance too, it's important to flag, you can eat almost any plant in the Pacific Northwest for at least a small window in the year if you really, really want to. But whether or not a plant can be harvested in large quantities and then stored over the long term, that really indicates its level of salience. And so these are all kind of the top storable, delicious foods that people would be harvesting. And of course, that's why when you think of plants that grow near the home and ones that you're tending over the long term, to store over the long term, that's the very definition of a garden, and why we started calling these forest gardens. Also, for those of you that know, it is a borrowed term for similar agroforestry practices that have been identified in Central America as well. Okay, so we knew forest gardens were a lot more rich based on our inventories, a lot more rich. And so we wanted to look at its functions as well. One of the ways that we did this was look at a series of plant traits in both those ecosystems, in the forest gardens and in the ambient conifer forests. And what we found, just as a taste, there's a bunch of traits, but I'll just share a few with you. Seed mass was really interesting. So seed mass was a lot higher in forest gardens, and that makes sense to some extent. Larger seed is larger fruit. That's the economically important part for people. But also larger seeds are harder to self-pollinate altogether in one spot like this. And so it may require an extra hand, literally a human hand, to propagate. And what we know from ethnographies among Gitxsan, Tsimshian, and Nisga'a is that the main kind of method of transplanting, at least locally, was to move things vegetatively. Right away, this tells us that these species aren't likely to assemble without some kind of commensal relationship with humans. I've collapsed these two traits because they're quite similar, and they essentially have the same value. All this is saying is that forest gardens have a higher frequency of animal dispersed and animal pollinated species. So this means that forest gardens are the result of animal movement, and of course humans are included in that category. But on top of that, this suggests that after people departed from the villages or were forcibly removed 150, 200 years ago, forest gardens began providing really unique and important habitat for animals and pollinators. These are huge biodiverse breaks in otherwise very continuous conifer forests. At all the sites we work at, moose, bear, and deer, elk are all very common, and the elders know this. When we're working with elders, it's like, they always say, oh, you're going to that place where it's really good to hunt. You know, there's this kind of just understanding that that is a place where animals are now. And so not only are forest gardens providing, you know, these important services in the past, they're also continuing to provide functions and services in the present. And I'll just kind of give you a snapshot of one of these places where we're doing intensive research at the landscape scale. This is, again, very historical ecology. The scale is the landscape. And so this is Ciencia. Again, this is in this northwestern part of British Columbia, just south of the Alaska Panhandle. And Ciencia is a large archaeological village complex in an even larger archaeological landscape spanning about 6,000 years of occupation. And it's a very rich cultural landscape. The community, the same titles and chiefly names have been carried out in the Adao in the oral histories from 6,000 years ago to present. So it's, you know, arguably a very long and consistent occupation. The reserve, where people were relocated to in the canyon, is just outside of here. So really the same lineages have been in this 20 square kilometer area for over 6,000 years. And you can see this is kind of a profile of the forest garden. So in this area here is the what we call the village core. There's 17 house platforms, and we've just excavated the first kind of smidgen of them. And behind the village is where we have the forest garden, and then behind that is the conifer forest. With Gitsalas and one of the youth programs last summer, we did a field school where we ran a bunch of high-level soil analyses, lidar and drone mapping, and my specialty, paleoethnobotany. And we did some dendrochronology work, which we did to ascertain whether or not the conifers were encroaching. And in fact, the crabapples, which are kind of the biggest one we could core, right? A lot of these species don't live past 60, although the root crown we tried to core did not work out. But the crabapples were significantly older than the conifer trees on the periphery, confirming what we thought, that the conifer trees are encroaching on these ecosystems, but at the same time that encroachment is happening very, very slowly. You know, this part of the Pacific Northwest is like very, very productive region. You know, you can log a forest and within 22 years, it's back to a mature stand. It's very, very productive. And so the fact that these places persist, you know, 150, 200 years since people stopped managing them is quite impressive and does indicate a level of resilience. And the soils, we love the soils. The soils are incredibly interesting. If you're looking for human-modified ecosystems, look underground. Again, thinking about that kind of breakdown of the village core, that was characterized by your typical kind of shellless midden, so 2 meters of anthropogenic types of soil. You can see Sierra there, lots of fire-cracked rock, lithics, fill, that kind of thing. On the other end, in the conifer forests, what we see are these just different types of podzols, so very acidic types of soils, very, very small organic horizons. In the middle, in the forest gardens, it was different from both. There wasn't that same kind of midden fill. There was more of a natural soil formation process, but there was literally, you know, 40 to 50 centimeters of just black earth. Excavating some of the pieces, or some of the bulk samples, we found, you know, very isolized salmon vertebra. This is really far from the river, so there's an expectation that people were maybe fertilizing, right, with salmon. And the paleo-ethnobotanical data was really interesting. I won't get into this too much, but basically no fossilized plants were located in the forest gardens, but in the village, within just like a liter of soil that was floated, and all the charred materials rise to the top, and then we identify those materials, and just in a single liter there were 19 plant taxa, all of which represented with forest garden species. I'm just running through some of the methods we're doing, and hopefully it kind of it has a bit of interest for you guys. But beyond the methods, you know, every single one of the communities that we've worked with, every single one of them, the historical ecology, the archaeology, it's really fascinating, but in the end, it's always the same question, time and again. How do we bring them back? How do we bring them back? How do we start managing these places again? And, you know, a lot of the management strategies and objectives are derived directly from the elders. I mean, they know how to breathe life back into these places, but the archaeology and the soil analyses, these have all been instrumental too in some ways in the process. So we've set up experimental plots, testing different management strategies, and we're also looking at recreating that soil matrix that we find in the village, in the forest garden site. We've taken hundreds and hundreds of cuttings from the forest garden to see which ones root and propagate. It's just an ongoing fly by the seat of your pants, like, how do we get these places breathing again? And as I alluded to in the beginning of the talk, these accounts of land use, of forest gardening and management, completely reject coloniality and colonial assertions that persist in our classrooms and in our courts. Loggers in BC, for example, are not want to accept that the forests were managed by people. In our courts, this is the same. I was called to the stand as an expert witness in the New Chatlet Rights and Title case, which is currently being held in the Supreme Court. And forest gardens were provided as one of the lines of evidence brought forward by the New Chatlet Nation because the Crown, the Canadian government, was using these very racist and outdated ideas about people and land use. They were claiming that the New Chatlet were just dispersed hunter-gatherers, that they didn't use the land, and so they had no title to it. Our research, of course, showed the exact opposite. And to quote Chief Jordan Michael here, he says, quote, "These forest gardens demonstrate how our laws were activated through our people and through the living knowledge of the land and water. Our forest gardens were not tended by the British. They were stewarded by my people long before the Queen knew the taste of a crab apple." As we kind of explore this idea of sources in historical ecology over the next few days, you know, in a lot of the literature, historical ecology is always conceived of as this very applied discipline, right? And I think that's very important. But beyond application, there's still a lot of framing and reframing and decolonizing that needs to be done, at least in settler nations with this research. In Gitxsan context, forest gardens are firmly situated in Gwilience. This is a mindset described by Don Ryan Hanemuch here as a 360 view of the land, looking forwards, looking backwards, but also encompassing the responsibility to ensure that waters, forests, and lands are protected for grandchildren and their children. And really importantly, this is not, just an ideology or for us a scientific experiment. This is part of their legal obligation to the WILP, to the land, their house group, which is the social unit and the foundation of their ecological, economic, and cultural systems. If you guys are familiar with Fikret Berkey's, he's done a lot of work on this where, there's traditional knowledge and then there's, management practices, and those are kind of nested. Surrounding all of those things are the social structures and the governance structures, right? We have all the tools and technology to, repair the land, but we're not doing it because of things like social structures, ideologies, and governance. So Gwilience, for example, is not captured in our grant writing, it's not captured in the courts, and it's certainly not captured in concepts of biodiversity or functional diversity. Hanemuch, Gwinanet, Malulik, all the hereditary leaders we work with assert that if we continue to present the land in terms of resources or polygons or fee simple lands, if we continue to translate things in this way, we're in trouble. The data and the scientific research are extremely important, and no one is saying that we reject that completely. But it is, by its very nature, it tends to erase the core values of the spiritual view of the land, of Gwilience, which allow these places to function. That people worked very hard to make peace with the salmon. That people worked very hard to make peace with the wetlands. And so as historical ecologists, how do we make peace with some of our own colonial superstructures that persist as we begin to start gathering more and more data and mobilizing our data. There's a bit of a cognitive dissonance between, or because, you know, something like this is close to, and we're getting closer to, but not entirely engaged with the realities that we're trying to support and uplift on the ground. And I'm cynical at times because the Canadian state still refuses to acknowledge or recognize Gitxsan, Wet'suwet'en, and Tsimshian sovereignty and title, despite all evidence pointing to their ownership resulting in more economically, socially, and ecologically rich outcomes. By the way, it doesn't mean people didn't make mistakes. The Adao are fundamentally built on this idea that great disasters are the mark of a society that's wise, that people learn from their mistakes, they culturally code them. And that is part of Gwilliance, which we don't capture, but I think, you know, as we kind of move towards this decolonial turn a little more, I do wonder how we can capture that in a way that's not appropriative, but also respectful. And on that cheerful question and point, I will end. Thank you so much. Oh, and please, a very, very big thank you to Leticia and Miguel so much for organizing this and inviting me, and this is just wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sorry. Thanks a lot, Chelsey. That was really inspiring and fascinating. I think, well, there's echo. We can call Peter if you don't mind coming back to the stage. We can start a round of discussion. I already see a couple of questions. Okay, we can share the room. Okay, so I'll start with Graciela. Your question. Yeah.
Thank you so much to both of you. It was really fascinating. I'm a natural scientist, so anything related to history is super inspiring to me. And I have questions for both of you. I will start with Chelsey. I really found fascinating your talk. Partially because I've also worked in Africa with indigenous people, and I've always found the way they treat the landscape interesting, and the way the state treats the people quite hurting. At the same time, I cannot deny that it's difficult to me to come to terms in how we understand wilderness. So when you say we compare two forests and we compare the functional traits in those two forests, one was like the northwestern temperate forest, and then the other one was the peripheral kind of thing. So let's assume that, like as you evidenced, you have your forest gardens that were assembled by human management for a long time. And then you were comparing them with a conifer forest. So my question here is, wouldn't you find logical that seed mass or dispersal traits are essentially different and not necessarily good, you know, in terms of what is good and what is bad? Just simply, these are different for us. So that'll be my question for you.
Yeah, and this is a wonderful question, and something I think, you know, we should definitely explore throughout the few weeks here. Like, what is a control? If you are looking at a landscape that's been altered by people and you're not sure which have been and haven't, I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect control, right? So the reason why we chose those two to compare was that all 14 sites had the same phenomena of the conifer forest, and it was less about highlighting the differences than just pointing out what is one doing. What is the forest, can you hear me okay? What is the forest garden doing? What are some of the things that it's doing, right? The conifer forest isn't part of like an experimental sample, and it's not really a control either, but there was no other thing to kind of compare it with. It was just the most, you know, it was the same, the conifer forest had the same aspect, the same elevation, the same, you know, it's just two different things going on. And still, it wasn't a wild conifer forest. There's still evidence of management. There's still evidence of fire. There's culturally modified trees in every single one of them.
Yeah, but then you have totally different species. So you cannot compare an apple tree with a pine tree, I guess.
Absolutely. And yeah, I guess I should say it's not pointing out like the biodiversity indices. We knew that just by standing in these places, you know one's going to be more biologically diverse than the other, but knowing by to which gradient and how much, the functional traits were a similar type of test where you're just pointing out a trend rather than saying better, worse, this is something completely different. And it plays out on the ground, like the fact that, okay, these are, you know, great spaces for animals. Well, that's what the elders are saying too. It's kind of just another way to present the data as a narrative, not so much as proving something versus the other. It's a narrative scope, but yeah.
Yeah. And then my question for Peter was about that. I think it was in preparation kind of work from the long boot database. And you were presenting ABIUS ALBA results. And I was wondering whether you've been able to compare these with results from natural archives, not historical archives, like cores from pit bogs and lakes.
Yeah, of course we do that as well, yes, quite often. Yes, this was just the historical data for this. For ABS, it would be, I mean, the disappearance is so recent that there's no point in, you know, comparing this to, I don't know, palynology. We know what happened, we just don't know why it happened. For other species, sure, yes, we do that as well. And of course, I talked a lot about archival sources, but they never tell the whole story, of course. You need all the rest, of course.
Yeah. Well, thanks to both of you.
Okay, thank you very much for both talks. They were fascinating, and I greatly enjoyed in particular the talk about Canada. I recently read Over's story, so it was very, you know, it was connecting a lot to the emotions that I had over this very long read. I wanted to bring in an Eastern European perspective into what you've been, what Chelsey you have been presenting on the indigenous people. So we also had, after 1945, a lot of displacement in this part of the world. And there is a lot of ecological legacy, I would say, that bears many similarities, but it hasn't been, perhaps Peter correct me, it hasn't been studied so much. I mean, it's something people talk about, something people can see, experience. Just to give two examples, one example is from the southeast corner of Poland and the displacement of the Ruthenian population, so Ukrainian, let's say, population from this area, both to Ukraine and to other parts of Poland. So we have these very, very richly populated villages in the Carpathians that today do not exist anymore. You wouldn't see any buildings, but these are actually ecological hotspots of biodiversity. And these relatively uniform forests of the conifer forests of the Carpathians, because all the orchards and everything, it was, you know, just left within a day. People were just forced in 1947, 48 to leave within a week and so on. And the plants just stayed, and they are still there, replanting. You can see different degree of rewilding. And it's something that exists in, let's say, the ecological activist discourse in Poland. But I think there is relatively recent research, relatively little research because it's so recent, yes? Another aspect would be in Western Poland, where the German population was displaced. And we never had enough population to, I mean, we as country, to resettle. So there is a lot of villages that were never resettled, and they are surrounded by industrial forests very often, like pine monoculture, but still the village sites would be exactly these witnesses to the biodiversity that the previous population maintained for hundreds of years, usually from the 14th century or something like that, when this area was colonized in the medieval times. So it was really interesting to me to listen to your presentation, because it bears so many similarities with what I observe in different parts of my part of the continent. So I just wanted to bring in this perspective. Thank you again.
Interesting.
Yeah, because there's some research on this, of course, but framing the dislocation of the Germans from Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic as some sort of a, in an indigenous, that would be extremely problematic. This is a highly nationalized, sort of very thorny issue. Of course, no one would like to talk about it this way.
I totally agree. It's a very difficult political question, of course. And yes, I didn't think that, of course, there is all the borderlands of Czechia, that probably I imagine have the same ecological story. But what is fascinating, at least from the perspective of someone who now kind of lives in these Western areas, is to see how there is, in many ways, a similar process of rupture, yes? That there has been some traditional landscape maintained for centuries, and it was just left standing, yes? And nothing was happening. And on many levels, it's fascinating, because you also have the hydrological level. There was a huge milling landscape. First, the Red Army destroyed it. Then, after 50 years, there was some maintenance for the communist time by the state-run farms. Then it collapsed after the fall of communism, and for the last 30 years you had complete rewilding even of the stream, of the local rivers and everything. So I would imagine that many, even if we avoid, and probably nobody would exploit the indigenous, I was not even thinking about this, aspect of this problem, but there would be interesting comparative aspects in terms of the social ecological processes, I imagine.
Yeah, and the rewilding thing is very contentious in a lot of places, and I think one of the, you can look at something like clam gardens, right? These are kind of intertidal managed coastlines that run from Alaska all the way to Northern California, and they have shown just indices of higher diversity of bivalves and all sorts of other intertidal species, but even though they are, quote, more diverse, they require human maintenance. That there is a plateau point where it is going to, it isn't going to have those same high rates of diversity and food access and all those things. So people are, like you were just alluding to at the very end there, that there's, a system in place that has both social and ecological roles. Yeah, thank you for that.
I just wanted to jump the queue a little bit to tell an example of displacement here also in Spain that is historically documented when this was a Muslim area for lots of centuries, and there was this wars for centuries about what is called reconquer or whatever, I don't know exactly the name, but this part of Andalusia was made Christian about the mid-13th century, and the Kingdom of Granada was conquered in the late 15th century, but the population remained there, so they were officially converted until they made a civil war in the end of the 16th century, and they were all deported. It was a huge genocide. But apart from the horrible part, the interesting part is that they kept the lands of all the properties were inventoried and were given to people coming from Castile, from the northern places, and where all properties are described in an archive in Granada, so they have thousands of individual properties with all the crops that were there and so on. And it really made a huge change, and it is a very large area, and I have never been to that document, but they exist, so it's very nice to think of displacement, this horrible stuff of displacement, but that's such a great opportunity for knowing. So.
Thank you very much both to Peter and Chelsey for such a cool and inspiring talks. I was going to ask a question about dating of your sites, Chelsey, but now I also need a little bit more Eastern European perspective. I just found it, I'm Ukrainian, I just found it so fascinating how the aquaculture-based societies are getting offhanded dismissed by the colonizers, because now we know that Ukrainians in the south of Ukraine and some other eastern steppe people like Kipchaks and Brodniks were really dependent on the fisheries and managed proto-aquaculture in the lower parts of Dnieper and Dniester and Pivdenny Bugh. And then Russian Empire waded in there, says, no aquaculture, no agriculture, and it's so backwards. Now we will bring the civilization here. And then, trying to bring an agriculture into the very arid region, the hydrological regime was screwed up, and by the 1950s, people needed to increase the productivity of the estuariums by introducing Caspian invertebrates, because fisheries crashed. But it was working just fine before it was offhandedly dismissed. Sorry.
No, that's fascinating.
But what I wanted to ask is, how do you date the forest gardens? Do you use dendrochronology, carbon isotopes, paleolimnology? And are there any evidence of like pre-Clovis human management of the forests anywhere in North America? I'm sorry, that is a very naive question.
No, that's fine. That's a great question. I might even defer to you on that one. Okay. Just for the first one, dating is really interesting, and archaeologists, we are compulsively obsessed with dates. Temporal control is very important, right? So dating an ecosystem, a live one, is a challenge for archaeologists because we're usually dating things below the ground. One of the kind of practices that we found, and I didn't get to talk about it, but using the paleoethnobotanical data as proxies for what could have been growing there. So for example, in the village core where the house depressions are, there's a series of caches. These are cultural depressions where people would have been storing and processing food, and very stratigraphically rich. So 40, 50 different kind of events or strata which can be directly dated using radiocarbon isotopes, which is the primary way of dating these, and looking at what's showing up in there. If it's one hazelnut, okay, maybe not, but if it's hazelnut, crabapple, the vacciniums, like all those forest garden species showing up in the same spot and dating that, we can probably say with relative ease that there's some relation there. But otherwise, the dendrochronology, like I said, it's very hard. The longest living species in forest gardens are apples, which live maybe up to 120 years, and that's if the center hasn't been completely rotted out, versus conifer trees, which have much longer lifespan. So the dendro work hasn't been great. The other thing we're doing is some phytolith work. Phytoliths tend to preserve really well when you have a nice open environment, like forest gardens have a nicer open canopy, and a lot of more forbs and grasses. And so that's another one that we're currently looking at. The oldest one that we've been able to date with that proxy method of the paleoethnobotanical data was 600 years ago. So not very long in historical context, but still, pre-colonial and definitely contradicting colonial narratives. Yeah. Thanks. That's a great question. Pre-Clovis management. I mean, that's a huge debate with mammals, but.
Yes, you should know.
No, you can.
No. I'm not doing this.
Do it.
No.
Hi. Thank you very much, both of you, for a fascinating talk. I have another question for Chelsey. Sorry, Peter. Kind of a specific question, actually. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to the magnitude of the difference in plant biodiversity between the forest gardens and the surrounding landscapes. And I'm interested in also the sort of temporal axis. So insofar as possible, you spoke about it a little bit just now, but what does that difference look like through time, insofar as you're able to speculate on the difference? And I'm also just curious about the use of pollen records in general in the area. Thank you.
Great. So biological diversity was basic. We just stuck to tree, shrub, and herbaceous layers. So mosses were not included in that. Grasses were, and it was very, very, very different. The forest gardens were much, much, much more rich. Tree diversity, if you're just looking at, tree species, single woody stem over 5 meters, was higher in the conifer forests, right? But shrub and herbaceous layers, and what we're seeing is the kind of mid-shrub layer, a lot more rich. So again, back to that idea of like one's not better or worse, and in fact it's probably their nice transect between both that is the most productive area. What was your second question? Dating, temporal range. I mean, it's interesting. I've been working with Natasha Lyons, and we're doing a huge metadata analysis of all the paleo-ethnobotanical work that's ever been done in British Columbia. So, you know, thousands and thousands of data sets, like what are the plant species showing up? There is a preservation bias for, you know, a lot of the root foods and carb food. Those aren't showing up archaeologically. All we get is what's charred. If you're really lucky, you might get some waterlogging and really nice preservation there, but all we get is charred remains that are, you know, dropped by a hearth and mist. And so there's all sorts of gaps in that data, but again, when you're working with really, really large data sets, you can sort of start to infer certain things. What we know is that a lot of those indicator species, like take the big ones, like Pacific crabapple, hazelnut, Saskatoon, Amelanchier, alnifolia, and Shipverdia canadensis are showing up consistently over thousands and thousands of years throughout the province, with a couple blips on the coast where there was maybe a shift in demographic, but otherwise pretty consistent use. As far as the management goes, the further we go back in time, the less and less we know. Third question.
Pollen.
Pollen. Yeah, so we've done, we're kind of in the like midst of figuring these places out. I should say we only started thinking of these Spachgangan like 5 years ago, right? This is very, very recent, but the phytolith and pollen trip was a big one that I was really hoping to get at, because this kind of environmental reconstruction versus just these proxies at ARC village sites was something we wanted to do. So one site has a really nice big old pond right behind it, and so this summer, now we just need someone to analyze it. If you know anyone that's very good at IDing pollen records in the Pacific Northwest, there's like one guy and he's retired, so if you know.
Thanks so much to both of you. I have a question for Peter, and I am a new ecologist, and I wonder if you have any advice for people like me who are interested in using archival data. How can we avoid making silly mistakes when we're trying to pull occurrence data from the archives?
There have been, in recent times, a few RANDs published as scientific papers. And they always said, and I agree with this, is get a historian or get a social scientist into your team, and that's how you do it, I think. I mean, you can do it otherwise, you know, but you'll make your life more difficult because you have to acquire the skills to do this, and you run the risk of misinterpretation, or, you know, it's just get someone who knows this stuff. Of course, the trouble is that you'll need to get someone who's interested in this, and there aren't so many of them. You know, it's just like the pollen guy. You know, it's like there's the one, and she's gonna be busy. Yeah, yeah. But that's the if you're really at the beginning, that's the best advice I have. Get someone who's get a historian, a social scientist, or someone who's doing what you're interested in.
Thank you. So I just wanted to add a comment, if I may, to Peter's answer. So you even need to get a specialist historian. Like, we are a team of historians and geologists and biologists, and I am a historian myself. But since we are working on like old Turkish documents from Greece, we need exactly the person who does that, because there is like such an amount of detail that needs to be understood, that bears on the interpretation, that like it comes with, so it's not that any historian can do anything. On the other hand, I can say that the historian that is doing that for us had nothing, was not an environmental historian at all before, but I think we managed to convert him. And he has a lot of neophyte and enthusiasm in a way. So in this sense, I would add a positive note. You can also get in touch with historians who haven't done something like that, but who have the skills that are really rare very often. Like the kind of documents he reads, perhaps 10 people can read, yes, at the moment. But it's enough. You can find one who would work with you, I think. So it's not impossible to get people on board, especially in the face of the current planetary crisis. I think they want to they like being involved and becoming relevant.
Maybe I'll just add to that too. Even with, I found in that court case, the Canadian government had their own team of archaeologists and anthropologists reviewing historical documents, and they would say to Chief Michael on the stand when he talked about forest gardening, they'd say, well, no, look here, Sprout said you didn't have agriculture. Like very, very, like the just baseline kind of reading of the historical materials without kind of any context or scholarly, just even tinkering. It was very, very, and these are archaeologists as well. And so, beyond even just the disciplinary focus, I think having kind of an ally, someone that wants to do the work and effectively will dig deep is important.
More questions? More comments?
So maybe just thank you very much for having been so nice. Maybe I'll applause for that. And two quick things. First, for formality issues, there is a signature sheet around, and we are not very formal people, so we lost it. So somewhere there is, yes, okay, there it is. So try to be sure that you sign your days here. It really doesn't matter if you are going to stay some days because you signed the other, but we have to keep track of the people. So do sign on the leaves. And then we have a dinner, a small dinner here right now. So it is right outside, and it's nice weather. We're going to be nice here outside. So we just meet tomorrow. We open at 9, start at 9:30. So we continue tomorrow with the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah.